Hey friend, I'm glad you're here tonight. Before we start, do me a quick favor, tap that like button and subscribe if you haven't already. It helps way more than you think. And while you're here, I'm curious, where are you watching from right now? And what time is it where you are? Midnight? 2 a.m.? Let me know down in the comments. I love seeing where everyone is listening from. Now, take a deep breath, and let's go somewhere you were never supposed to see. Somewhere that stank of blood and smoke, where no one made eye contact unless they had to, and where your title came with silence instead of honor. Being an executioner in medieval Europe wasn't a job. It was a sentence. Not for a crime you committed, but for one you carried out again and again, with your hands, your eyes, your steel, and your soul. People think of the executioner as a figure in black, a hood, an axe, a raised arm. But that's theater. The real man was nothing like a shadow on a stage. He was a butcher, a surgeon, a gravedigger, and a ghost all at once. The day began before the bells. You didn't live in the town. You lived on the edge of it. Sometimes beyond the walls, near the leper house, or in a hut near the gallows tree. You weren't allowed in church. You weren't allowed to sit at the same table as other men. Your children were called cursed. Your wife, if you had one, was the last to be blessed and the first to be blamed. The town needed you, but it didn't want you. You were tolerated like plague rats were tolerated because they cleaned out the filth. And that was your role, to take out the human filth, to be the reminder, to do what the righteous could not admit was necessary. When dawn came, you rose alone. There was no breakfast, no prayer. You didn't pray anymore. What God would listen to a man who crushed ribs for a living? Your tools had to be clean, not for mercy, but for efficiency. Dull edges meant screams. Screams meant curses. Curses meant the crowd turned ugly. And you'd seen it before the way they blamed you for the sounds. As if the man on the platform didn't deserve what was coming. As if the knife had betrayed their sense of justice. You cleaned your blade with vinegar and fire. Your rope had to be strong, your axe had to be balanced, and your nerves had to be still as frost. Because if you missed, if you fumbled, it was your shame. Not theirs, yours. And it never left you. The first time you behead a man, the silence is louder than the crowd. Your ears ring, your arms tremble. You don't sleep that night, or the night after, but the town doesn't care. It needs you again soon. There are thieves, witches, traitors, heretics, adulterers, liars. The sins never stop, and neither do you. You learn to look past the eyes, past the voices, past the pleading. You learn to see only the shape, the way the neck bends, the way the spine shifts, the timing of the drop. Some you hang, some you burn, some you flay. Not all executions are quick. Some take hours, some are warnings. Public death had a rhythm. It was part of market day. People sold meat near the scaffold. Children watched with meat pies in hand. The town square didn't flinch, but you did. Quietly, alone. You weren't allowed to speak during the act, not even to the condemned. Some whispered prayers. Some cursed you. Some cried for mothers. You listened to none of it. You couldn't. Mercy was not your role. Mercy belonged to the priest. You were the blade. Just the blade. They called you Master of Death, but they didn't mean it kindly. You couldn't eat at the tavern. You couldn't join a guild. You touched the untouchable, and in return, you became untouchable too. Even when you walked the streets, people moved away. They spat after you passed. Children were taught not to look you in the eye. And when your work was done, you washed the blood off your hands, but never your name. That stain stayed. Sometimes you were called to torture, not to kill, just to hurt. To open the body and leave it breathing. Iron boots, the rack, the press, thumbs crushed to paste, screams that went on too long. You told yourself it was justice. You told yourself they were guilty. But sometimes they weren't, and that sat in you like rot. You weren't taught this. No one trained you. Maybe your father was an executioner? Maybe you were a soldier once, good with a blade. Or maybe you made one mistake, and this was your only way back to a roof and bread. Whatever path led here, it never led out. No one retires from this. You die with the blood of hundreds in your memory, and no one carves your name with honor. You learn to drink, not because you enjoy it, because sleep won't come without it. And when it does come, it brings faces. Every face. The boy who stole grain, the woman who begged, the man who screamed your name like it was a curse. You see them all, over and over. And still, the town watches. Still, the town needs you. Some nights, they knock on your door and ask for help with animals, with childbirth, with wounds. Because you know flesh. You've cut more bodies than the physician. You're skilled. And in those moments, they speak softly, kindly, until the job is done. Then they leave. Always. The gallows creak in the wind. You hear it when you sleep. The axe sits in the corner of your home like a second spine. You dream of bones, of knots in the rope, of eyes that do not close. And when the next name comes, you do it again. You always do, because you were chosen. Not for your strength, not for your heart, but because no one else would. And that is the curse. To be necessary and unwanted. To keep the peace by breaking bodies. To serve justice with blood on your hands. They never tell you that part. No one writes songs for the hangman, but you remember. Every name, every cry, every last word. The worst part was not the blood, it was the waiting. The time between sentencing and execution was yours to carry, not theirs. While the townsfolk gossiped and the magistrate dined, you sharpened your blades in silence, listening to the rats beneath your floorboards and the wind crawling through the gallows like it remembered every name you'd ever spoken. You learned how many days it took for a man to beg for death. You learned which ones went quiet and which ones started screaming before the rope was ever knotted. You knew the weight of a body before it dropped. You knew what it looked like when a soul didn't want to leave. You knew how to feel the spine give under pressure. Your hands stopped shaking after the 5th execution. But the dreams didn't, not ever. You woke with dirt in your mouth, with the smell of charred flesh thick in your nose, with your fingers clenched as if they still held the handle of the axe. You sat alone by candlelight and watched the flame dance like the eyes of someone who swore they were innocent. You remembered their words. You remembered all of them. You didn't choose to. It just happened. Memory was cruel that way. The townspeople avoided you in the daylight, but at night, they came with questions, with bribes, with fear. A father asked if his daughter could be spared the fire. A wife begged you to make it quick. A merchant offered coin to look the other way, but you couldn't. Not because you were loyal, because you were watched too. They watched you, like they watched the condemned. If you flinched, if you hesitated, if you showed mercy, it would be you kneeling on the platform next. The people who hated you were the same ones who demanded your precision. You were a monster only until they needed one. Then you were a craftsman, a surgeon, a priest in reverse. Your hands did what no one else would, and that made you dangerous. You weren't allowed to bury your own dead. Your children had to marry in other towns. If they could, some didn't. The curse lingered in your name. You were marked. Even if you left, someone always knew, always whispered, always looked just long enough to tell their children not to grow up like you. But no one ever asked how you got here. They never asked why your nails were cracked or why your voice shook when you spoke too long. They didn't ask how many you'd killed. Only if you'd be ready by Sunday. The scaffold had to be swept, the ropes prepared, the platform tested. You checked the weight, the knots, the crossbeam. Everything had to work. Because if it failed, it was your fault. If the body didn't die fast enough, if the blood sprayed too far, if the screaming lasted too long, they wouldn't blame the criminal. They'd blame you. Your precision had to be perfect. Your cruelty just measured enough to satisfy the crowd, but not so much that it became spectacle. You walked a knife's edge with every swing. Too quick, and they thought you merciful. Too slow, and they thought you wicked. There was no winning, only surviving. You were given a house, usually by the edge of the graveyard. It smelled of mold and earth. Sometimes you buried the dead yourself. Not because it was required, because no one else would. No one wanted to touch the cursed, so you did. With shaking hands, with quiet prayers that went unanswered, you stopped wearing the hood eventually. It didn't matter. They already knew your face. The children still pointed, the drunks still spat. The priest still avoided your eyes, but at least you could see the sky. Some days it rained, and you sat by the stocks watching water pool in the old cuts on your hands. You told yourself the sky didn't judge you, but part of you still wondered. Every time lightning struck, you counted the seconds between flash and sound as if punishment had a schedule. You didn't count the heads anymore. You counted bones, how many snapped, how many shattered. You cleaned your blades in vinegar, then left them in ash. You whispered to them, not because you were mad, but because it helped. The axe never answered, but it listened, better than most. Once, a woman survived the pyre. It wasn't your fire. You weren't the one who lit it. But when the flames failed and her screaming rose louder than the chants, they called for you. You stepped in with your blade, and the town cheered. They called you merciful that day, but no one met your eyes. Not even the priest who whispered the final prayer. You buried her that night yourself, dug the hole with your own hands. No ceremony, just earth and breath and silence. You didn't sleep for 3 nights. Her scream followed you into every corner of your dreams. You wanted to believe she'd forgiven you, but you didn't believe in forgiveness anymore. Not really. There was no time for it. Only time for preparation. The wheel, the gallows, the fire, the sword. You learned every method. You had to. Some crimes demanded certain deaths. The crown cared about tradition. You carried a book of sentences, not for the law, but for precision. Which bone to strike, which vein to slice. How to quarter without shame. You learned anatomy by accident. How the lungs deflated. How the stomach gurgled. How long the body spasmed after the head fell. You knew too much. And yet, you were seen as dumb. As muscle. As meat that swung the blade. You let them believe it. It made it easier. If they thought you were stupid, they didn't fear you as much. If they didn't fear you, they might forget you. And forgetting was mercy. You started speaking less. Not because you had nothing to say, because everything you said sounded wrong. Too sharp. Too honest. You once told a magistrate the gallows beam would fail in the rain. He ignored you. It collapsed mid-hanging. The man dangled for minutes, legs kicking, eyes bulging. The crowd panicked. The magistrate blamed you. You built the next beam yourself. With your own coin, with your own sweat. No one thanked you. They never did. You were not here to be thanked. You were here to finish what others couldn't start. And when your blade dropped, so did their guilt. That was the real truth. They used you to clean their souls. But no one ever cleaned yours. The strangest thing about killing men for a living is how often they begin to look the same. Not in the face, those stayed different, but in the way they walk to the scaffold, the way they breathe, the way the fear settles into their shoulders, even when they pretend it doesn't. You start to see patterns. You recognize the trembling that starts just below the thumb, the stutter in the step, the long, deliberate blink before they kneel. Every man thinks he'll face death with courage. Almost none do, and you're the last thing they see. Not the sky, not their family. You, always you. Sometimes they spit. Sometimes they pray. Sometimes they smile like fools, trying to bluff their way into the afterlife. You don't answer. You can't. Any word from you feels like betrayal, like offering comfort right before you end them. You learned that mistake once. You told a thief it would be fast. It wasn't. The axe caught bone. The body twitched too long. His family cursed you for years after, as if you were the one who stole the bread, as if you were the one who sentenced him. You weren't. You never were. But they never remembered that. The law spoke in ink. You spoke in steel. That was the difference. That was the burden. And no ink ever stained the hands of the judge the way blood stained yours. There were days when the names blurred, when the faces bled into each other like candle wax, when you woke not knowing which day it was, which limb you'd severed last, which scream was real. You stopped counting seasons. The only calendar you kept was the rhythm of executions. Holy days. Market days, festival hangings. You sharpened your blades to the sound of church bells. You prepared the scaffold before weddings, before harvest feasts, before coronations. It never stopped. It never paused. Death didn't wait for permission. It only waited for you. You tried to keep your hands clean, but the smell of iron stayed under your nails. You bathed in vinegar and ash. You rubbed your skin until it cracked, but still, you could smell it. On your clothes, on your breath, in your dreams. The only time it faded was during storms, when the wind howled loud enough to drown out memory. That was when you walked the fields, alone, cloaked, face bare to the rain. That was what... Then you felt almost human again, but the stillness never lasted, and the duty always returned. Once, a boy no older than 15 was brought into your care, accused of taking what wasn't his. A simple animal, the decision had already been made. The one who offered prayers came too late. The crowd came too soon. You watched the boy tremble and insist on his innocence. His mother collapsed, overwhelmed. You said nothing. You had spoken too much in the past. The materials were coarse. The structure was aged. When the moment came, it faltered. He moved, trembled. The crowd grew quiet. The decision-maker turned pale. You brought closure with practiced precision. One decisive gesture that ended the struggle. No one reacted. No one spoke. You heard only the groan of old wood and the quiet grief of a woman who would never understand. That night, you didn't eat. You didn't sleep. You sat by the fire and pressed your hand to your face until everything inside settled. And in the stillness, you whispered his name. Just once. Just so it wouldn't vanish. You kept a list, not written down. Only in your thoughts. The ones who looked at you. The ones who smiled. The ones who sang softly as they walked. You remembered the woman who gently touched your hand before her departure. Said she held no anger. Said it wasn't your fault. You didn't believe her. But her face lived in your mind more vividly than your own. When you passed a mirror, you no longer saw yourself. You saw the role, the responsibility, the burden. Your body wore down faster, your posture bent, your hands closed inwards. Not from illness, from routine. You always held something. A tool, a memory, a task. Even when empty, your hands stayed clenched. You learned to rest with them curled against your chest. Like reflex, like residue, people told stories about you. The children whispered strange things. That you lived alone among old objects, that your home felt strange, that your eyes could see truth. You didn't argue. It was easier to let it be. Fear gave more distance than sympathy. Sympathy led to questions. Questions led to danger. But fear? Fear kept things quiet. And quiet meant peace. At times, you placed small coins beside those who left this world, not by law, but by instinct. You'd seen what happened when things remained unfinished. The strange dreams, the lingering thoughts, the silence that stuck in your throat. You spoke quietly afterward, said their names, said goodbye. Not for them, for yourself. Because often no one else did. You weren't the villain. But you had become the shape of what they feared, for their comfort, for the laws, for the illusion of order. They wanted to believe that endings were neat, that judgment was simple. But you knew better. Judgment came with weight and stillness, and you were the one left holding it. The sun never warmed you the way it did others. You felt it, yes, but not the same. For them, it was comfort, a gentle relief after cold nights. A soft touch during their walks. For you, it was exposure, a light that never dimmed. You moved through town like an outline drawn in chalk present, but never truly acknowledged. No one greeted you, no one used your name. They didn't smile, but they always noticed. They always stepped away. Mothers turned children's heads. Vendors made signs for luck. Some whispered softly when you passed, not for you, but to keep you away. You weren't a person. You were the reminder, a symbol of what happened when boundaries were crossed. You stopped trying to speak. Even kindness was misunderstood. A simple greeting could feel like a warning. so you saved your voice for the creatures. The dog that lingered near your steps, the dark feathered bird that sat above your station, watching with quiet stillness. They never flinched. They never looked away. They never denied you. You fed the dog scraps from your table. It never made noise, never demanded, only waited. In the colder seasons, it would curl by your door. You never named it. You didn't name anything anymore. Names made things real. Names made things stay. And in your world, nothing stayed. Not faces, not voices, not warmth. You began to track the days by the sounds of need. A distant shout meant trouble. A cough behind closed doors meant someone was fading. A knock at night meant something had been revealed or brought forth. Those were the worst. The late knocks, they came with ink and wax, with instruction. Proceed quickly, they said. Keep it quiet. And you did. You always did. You stopped asking. The answers only hurt more. You didn't want to know why a girl had to go. You didn't want to know why someone with strong words had to be silenced. You didn't want to know why a soldier who came back too late was yours to handle. You just carried out the task. Your hands obeyed. Your heart had stopped resisting long ago. The only time it stirred was in the quiet moments. The hours before dawn. The walks through the graveyard. The cold breeze that whispered through the trees, carrying the voices of no one and everyone. That's when you remembered who you were. Before the blood. Before the weight. Before the world gave you this name and asked you to wear it like armor. You remembered your brother's laugh, your mother's prayers, the way you used to believe in fairness. That was the hardest thing to lose. The belief that justice was pure. You knew now that justice had teeth, and that sometimes those teeth bit the innocent just as often as the guilty. You once asked a priest if what you did damned you. He said nothing. Just looked at you the way people looked at sick dogs sadly, distantly, already mourning. After that, you stopped asking. You didn't go to Mass anymore. You stood outside the church during holy days, close enough to hear the hymns, but far enough that no one noticed your absence. That was the key to survival, to be invisible in plain sight, to be so necessary that they couldn't banish you, but so reviled that they never welcomed you. You were the hinge between their law and their fear. You were tolerated like rats on a ship only until the hull stayed intact. The worst were the ones who smiled, the ones who came to the scaffold with shining eyes, with heads held high, the martyrs, the zealots, the unrepentant. They made you feel something, and feeling was dangerous. Feeling cracked the stone you'd worked so hard to become. One of them laughed as you tightened the rope, said he forgave you, said he hoped your soul was light. You didn't respond, but that night you wept into your hands until your nose bled. Because what if he was right? What if forgiveness was real? What if all this pain, all this silence, all this darkness, what if it didn't have to be like this? But it did. Of course it did. You knew that. There was no way out. You'd seen what happened to those who refused the work. They vanished, exiled, forgotten. The town could not function without death, and someone had to deliver it. So you stayed. You swung. You dug. You burned. You obeyed. You began to hate the sound of laughter. Not because it mocked you, because it reminded you of what you'd lost, of the things you'd never have again. Companionship, touch, trust. The touch of another person was foreign now. Accidental brushes felt like wounds. You couldn't remember the last time someone reached for you without flinching. You told yourself it didn't matter, but it did. It always did. One winter, the bodies piled too high. There wasn't time to bury them all. The plague had come through weeks earlier, and now they were burning piles on the edge of town. You were called in not to kill, but to sort, to separate the dead from the dying, to mark the ones still breathing. You walked among them with a torch and chalk. Eyes stared. Some begged. Some prayed. You couldn't tell who was who. You marked the ones who twitched, who whispered, who moved. And sometimes you were wrong. Sometimes the torchlight tricked you. Sometimes the wind moved a hand you thought was dead. And sometimes the ones you saved cursed you, said death would have been kinder. You agreed. But you said nothing. You always said nothing. Words were weapons here, and yours were too heavy. When the pyres burned, you stood at a distance, watched the smoke rise into the sky like dark prayers. You wondered if the heavens choked on them, if the angels turned away, if even God refused to watch anymore. You didn't eat for 3 days after that. Not because you couldn't, because your stomach rebelled. Every bite tasted like ash. Every swallow came with the memory of blistered skin and melted eyes. You wanted to sleep, but your dreams were louder than the fire. So you sat, awake, cold, listening, always listening. You heard footsteps that weren't there, voices that belonged to no one, screams that didn't stop, not even when the wind blew them away. You began to write, not much, just names, dates, little symbols. You etched them into wood, into stone, into the dirt behind your house. You weren't sure why. Maybe to remember, maybe to apologize, maybe because if you stopped, you'd disappear too. You kept a journal once, years ago, before the work swallowed you. You found it again during a storm. The ink was faded, the words barely legible, but they were yours. They spoke of hope, of honor, of wanting to protect. You laughed. A deep, broken sound that didn't feel like it came from your mouth. You burned it that night, watched it curl and vanish, because that man was dead, and this one had no need for illusions. The boy who dreamed of being a knight was gone, replaced by the man who chopped off their heads. You stopped asking for warmth a long time ago. The hearth in your house burned low, not for lack of wood, but because the fire meant comfort, and comfort was a lie you couldn't afford. The town gave you a cottage near the edge of the marsh, where the fog rolled in like old ghosts and the frogs croaked names you swore you'd heard before. It was quiet there, too quiet. You'd sit by the window and watch the mist creep along the ground, wondering if this was what the dead saw before they reached judgment. No sounds but the wind and the frogs and the occasional owl with eyes too wide. You lived among silence, but silence was never peace. It was weight. It pressed against your ribs. It settled into your skin like cold water. Some nights you sat on the floor, back to the wall, waiting for the knock you knew wouldn't come. Because no one visited, no one dared. And even if they had, what would you say? What would you offer? Tea? Bread? A chair stained with old blood that never quite left the grain of the wood? You learned not to expect company? You kept the door bolted, not for safety, for privacy. The act of opening it became a ritual. Something you did only when called, like a dog answering a whistle. And when they called, it was never soft. It was never gentle. It was a demand, a summons, an obligation. Death has no manners. It simply arrives, and you, by trade, must meet it. There were nights when the executions were delayed, when the crowd had to wait in the rain, growing restless, growing mean. You stood behind the platform, feeling their eyes through the boards. They didn't know it was you, not yet. The hood helped, but eventually you stepped forward, and the silence broke like rotted wood. The murmurs, the shifting feet, the nervous laughter of children brought by fathers who wanted to teach them something about justice, or fear, or power. You never looked at the crowd. You never met their gaze. They weren't there for you. They were there for the ritual, the performance, the public reckoning. And you were the instrument, not the man, never the man. When it was over, when the blade had fallen or the rope gone taut, you stood there a moment longer than necessary. Not for drama, for stillness. Because in that moment, you could hear yourself again. You could feel the beat of your heart and know you were still here, still cursed, still carrying out the will of those too cowardly to lift the blade themselves. You wondered sometimes how many of them could do what you did, if given the axe, if told to act. You knew the answer. None. That's why you existed. You weren't born to this. No one was. But someone had to be the hand. Someone had to make the cut. And once you did it, once the blood was on your boots and the screams lived in your ears, they made sure you never did anything else. You were marked. Not officially, but spiritually, socially. They laughed in taverns about the hangman's cursed breath. They whispered that your children would be born with black eyes and twisted fingers. And even when you saved lives, when you stopped a man from choking in the street, when you helped rebuild a collapsed house after the storm no one remembered, goodness was not your currency. Only fear, only silence, only distance. So you stopped trying. You lived in the distance. You wore it like a second skin. You sat by the fire with your cup and stared at the wall until your breath slowed. That was your peace, not forgiveness, not love, stillness, nothing. You began carving small figures from wood. At first, they were abstract lines, shapes, rough and meaningless. But over time, they took on faces. Not of the living, not of the townsfolk, but of the dead. You didn't plan it. It just happened. Your hands remembered what your eyes couldn't forget. A crooked nose, a scar near the brow, the way the mouth opened just before the drop. You lined the figures along the edge of your hearth, one for each. The collection grew. You didn't count them. You didn't name them. But when the wind howled through the cracks in your shutters, they stayed upright. Watching, reminding. Sometimes you dreamed of laying down the axe, of walking into the woods and never coming back. But even the forest wouldn't take you. You tried once. Took only your cloak and a loaf of bread and walked until your legs ached. Slept under the stars. Listened to the wolves. And when the sun rose, you turned around. Not because you were afraid. Because the rope was still waiting. The blade was still sharp. The gallows still stood. And your name, your cursed, necessary name, was still etched in their books. You once asked the gravedigger how he bore it. The weight of all those bodies. He shrugged. Said the dead were quieter than the living. Said they didn't lie, didn't cheat, didn't scream. He smiled, toothless and soft. Then looked at you and added, "But they didn't die by my hand." You nodded. Of course they didn't. That was your burden. The weight of the final breath. The crack of the spine. The silence that followed. You envied him, not because he buried the dead, because he never had to look them in the eye. When winter came, everything slowed. Even the executions. Fewer crimes. Fewer people on the streets, but not fewer ghosts. They multiplied in the cold, in the long nights, in the spaces between sleep. You woke more often, sweating, heart pounding, throat dry. Sometimes you heard knocking. Sometimes you heard your name. Sometimes you dreamed of walking into the square and finding a scaffold waiting for you. No crowd, no priest, just the rope and a letter nailed to the post. Your turn. You always woke before you saw who put it there, and you never slept again after. You began to age differently. Not in years. In wear. Your knees stiffened, your back curled, your hair thinned. But it wasn't time. It was the grindstone of repetition, of horror without pause. You ate less, spoke less, moved like someone already half dead, and no one noticed, because you'd always looked that way to them. Even when you were young, even when you had laughter in your throat and strength in your arms, they saw only the mask, the myth, the monster. You tried to remember the first one, the first body, the first swing, but it blurred now, blended into the noise of all the others. You remembered the feeling though, the way your stomach turned, the way your hands shook, the way you vomited behind the courthouse steps and thought, "I can't do this again." But you did, again and again and again, until the vomiting stopped, until the shaking faded, until the breath you once held in your throat became part of the rhythm. You stopped thinking of them as people, not out of cruelty, out of necessity. A butcher doesn't name the pigs, a soldier doesn't weep for the enemy, and a hangman cannot see a child when tying the rope. You built a wall in your mind, thick, high, impenetrable. But sometimes cracks appeared, a voice, a gesture, a face that reminded you of someone from another life, and the wall trembled. And for a moment, you remembered what it meant to be a man. That was the worst part, remembering, because it meant you'd forgotten, and forgetting was what kept you alive. The first time someone thanked you, it felt like blasphemy. A woman whose husband you'd hanged came to your door months later with a basket of bread and a quiet nod. She didn't speak, just placed the basket down and looked at you with eyes hollowed out by grief and time. You didn't take it at first. You didn't move. But she stayed there, still, unmoving, like a statue molded by sorrow, until the wind made her shawl shiver and her fingers tremble. Finally, she said the words, "He suffered long enough before you." Then she turned and walked away. You stared at the bread until the sky darkened and the crusts grew hard. You never ate it. But you kept the cloth it was wrapped in, folded it, washed it, tucked it into the corner of your shelf beside the tools you used to sharpen your axe. It smelled faintly of rosemary and ash. Sometimes you pressed it to your face and wondered if that's what forgiveness might have smelled like. You didn't seek thanks, you didn't believe in redemption. But that day, something shifted, not in the town, not in the air, but in the way your own voice sounded when you whispered to yourself in the dark. A little softer, a little less like gravel and guilt. You remembered her eyes, and for once, they didn't haunt you. They anchored you. In the spring, they brought you a heretic. Not for execution, but for interrogation. The bishop himself oversaw the questions. You were told to prepare the room. That's all. Nothing more. But you stayed. You always stayed. You watched as the man answered softly, rationally, reasonably. He didn't scream. He didn't plead. He simply asked his own questions about God, about truth, about the ends of the stars. You didn't know what he'd said to anger them. You didn't ask. But by the third day, the bishop's voice had grown hoarse and his patience had thinned to threads. You were told to begin. You didn't look at the man. You only looked at the tools, the weights, the rack, the fire. You used what you were trained to use, not to kill, to break. And still, he didn't scream, only whispered, again and again, a single phrase you didn't understand. You remembered it. You remembered the way his eyes stayed dry and his breath stayed steady, and the way he looked at you as if you were the one being judged. When it ended, the bishop thanked you. You didn't respond. You couldn't. That night, you sat outside the cottage and listened to the wind and wondered what the man had meant. You tried to repeat the phrase, but it slipped from your tongue like oil. You couldn't hold it, couldn't keep it. You dreamt of fire, of ropes around your own limbs, of the man smiling as the sky cracked open and the stars whispered your name. After that, you refused all tortures. You told them your hands were ruined, your back too weak, your tools too dull. They believed you, or pretended to. It didn't matter. They stopped asking. But you knew they'd remember. The bishop's eyes lingered too long. You began to check your door more often. You stopped lighting candles at night. You wrote no more names in the wood. You spoke to no one. Not even the dog. You buried the cloth with rosemary, deep beneath the roots of the old birch behind your house, just in case. One day the gallows collapsed. Old wood, rotten from rain and time. No one was hurt, but the town panicked. They said it was a sign, a warning, an omen. They asked you to rebuild it. You didn't want to. Not because of the labor, because of the message. But you did. You always did. You carved the beams yourself, hauled the posts, reinforced the joints, worked for 3 days straight without rest. When it was done, you stepped back and felt your knees shake, not from exhaustion, from certainty. It would stand for another decade. At least, long enough for names you didn't know yet, long enough for hands not yet bloodied. That night, the wind was too still, the marsh too quiet. You slept with the axe beside your bed. Not because you feared attack, because it was all you knew. Your companion, your confessor, your inheritance. You remembered your father's hands, how calloused they were, how they never touched you without flinching. You understood now, the distance, the silence. He had been the hand before you. You had inherited his tools, his name, his curse. He died alone. No one claimed his body. You buried him yourself beneath the same birch. No headstone, just dirt, just silence. You used to hate him. Now you missed him, because only he would understand the weight, the sound, the nothingness that came after the blood stopped. You once asked a traveling monk if it was possible to cleanse a life without confession. He looked at you for a long time, then said nothing, just walked away. You understood. Some stains are too deep. Some wounds never clot. Some silences mean more than words ever could. The last execution you performed was a boy, 13, caught with a dagger. The blade hadn't drawn blood, but the law was the law. The judge didn't look at you when he signed the paper. The priest didn't show. You tied the rope with numb fingers. The boy was silent, didn't fight, didn't cry, just looked at you and asked, "Will it hurt?" You didn't answer. You never answered. But something in you cracked. And when the lever dropped, you looked away. For the first time, you didn't watch. You didn't listen. You didn't breathe. You just waited for the silence. It came, as always, but it felt heavier than before. That night, you took down the rope and burned it, slowly, thread by thread. You poured vinegar over the ashes and buried them beneath the birch. You didn't write his name. You didn't carve his face. You just sat on the ground and let the rain fall on your shoulders until the mud swallowed your knees. When you stood, you knew you were done, not because the town had changed, not because the law had softened, because something in you had died, and nothing remained to hold the axe. The next morning you packed your tools in a sack and left before the sun rose. No one saw you. No one stopped you. You walked until your feet bled, until your shadow disappeared behind hills you'd never crossed before. You didn't know where you were going, only that it wasn't back. The road didn't care who you were. It didn't flinch when you passed. It didn't judge. And for the first time in your life, neither did you. The road was not kind, but it was honest. It did not whisper names you couldn't forget. It did not creak under the weight of another man's judgment. It stretched forward, empty and indifferent, carved through woods that had never heard your footsteps before. That first morning, the air felt thinner, not cleaner, not softer, just thinner, like silence you hadn't earned yet. The birds didn't scatter at your presence. The sun did not flinch. You walked until your legs stopped feeling like your own. The sack on your back dug into your shoulder blades, and the axe inside it thudded with each step like a second heartbeat. You didn't know why you brought it. You told yourself it was for protection. But deep down, you knew better. You couldn't part with it. Not yet. Not fully. It had become more than a tool. It had become your shadow. At dusk, you found a patch of earth beside a river. The water was cold, fast, filled with foam and fish and something older than memory. You sat on the bank and stared at your hands. They were cracked, the skin along your knuckles pulled tight, the nails yellowed from years of ash and vinegar. You dipped them in the water and felt pain before relief, like the blood was finally peeling off. But it wasn't, not really. You boiled lentils over a small fire, ate them slowly, felt each swallow like a stone in your gut. You tried to sleep, but the dreams came. The rope, the blade, the faces, all of them staring, all of them asking, not why you killed, but why you watched, why you listened, why you remembered. You woke before dawn, fingers curled around the axe handle like it had crawled into your palm on its own. You rose, poured water over the ashes of your fire, and kept walking. The first town you reached was too small for gallows. No courthouse, no stocks. Just a church, a tavern, a market, and people who didn't know your face. You slept in the stables, offered to fix a broken cart axle in exchange for bread and silence. No one asked your name. No one asked where you came from. You stayed 2 days, then moved on. Not because you were found, because you were afraid you might stay. That you might forget why you left, and forgetting felt like betrayal. You followed the river for weeks. It curved like a question you couldn't answer, winding through hills, cutting through forests, always whispering. You passed ruins too old for stories. Stones stacked by hands, now dust. You saw wolves in the distance, eyes glowing like embers, but they never approached. Even beasts respected your solitude. In one village, they thought you were a soldier. You didn't correct them. A woman gave you a loaf of rye bread without speaking. You left a coin you hadn't touched in years on her doorstep before you vanished into the trees. You tried to pray once, kneeling beside a stream, hands folded awkwardly, head bowed like you remembered from childhood. But the words didn't come, only images, bones, fire, the sound of a neck snapping. You stood and washed your face until the memory drowned. Eventually, you stopped counting the days. The calendar in your mind, the one marked by executions and orders and rope, fell silent. The quiet stretched. And in that quiet, you began to remember other things. Your brother's voice, the smell of bread rising in your mother's oven, the way your father once sang to himself before he became what you became. You remembered the girl with the ribbon in her hair who used to watch you from behind the baker's stall. You'd never spoken to her, but she smiled once, and you carried that smile longer than you carried your name. The axe stayed wrapped in cloth, buried at the bottom of your sack. Some days you forgot it was there. Other days, your hand drifted toward it without thinking, like muscle memory. You never used it again, but you couldn't leave it behind. Not yet. It was still part of you, like scar tissue, like shadow. Then came the cabin, half collapsed, deep in the woods, untouched by man or storm for years. Moss along the roof, a broken door, the scent of damp wood and forgotten stories. You rebuilt it slowly, piece by piece, repaired the hearth, patched the walls with bark and mud, cleared the vines from the windows. No one knew you were there. That was the point. You trapped rabbits, gathered roots, boiled wild herbs you didn't have names for. The days blurred into each other. Not from monotony, from peace. Real peace. The kind that doesn't announce itself. The kind that settles in your bones like warmth instead of weight. But even in peace, the past did not die. It waited, quietly, like the axe beneath your bed. One evening, the knock came. Not a dream, not a memory. A real knock. Slow, firm, human. You opened the door and found a man in his 30s, wearing a traveler's cloak soaked from the rain. He didn't smile, didn't flinch. He just asked, "Were you the one from Greymore?" You didn't answer, but he knew. He sat by your fire, said his brother had died by your rope, said he had hated you for years, dreamed of finding you, of breaking your bones with the same indifference you'd once shown. You watched him speak and said nothing, not from fear, from fatigue. He fell silent eventually, looked at your hands, looked at the axe, looked at the cabin, then said, "I thought you'd be more of a monster." You replied with the first full sentence you'd spoken in weeks. "So did I." He didn't stay, didn't threaten, didn't ask for forgiveness. Just left, disappearing into the rain like he'd never been there. But you knew he had. Because that night, you burned the axe. You built a fire so hot it split the stones in the hearth. Watched the metal warp, the wood scream. When it was ash, you scattered it into the river and let it carry the weight away. For the first time, your hands felt light. Not clean, not innocent, just light. Days passed. Then seasons. The forest changed. The wolves came closer, not for threat, for company. You began carving again. Not faces, not names, just shapes. Trees, animals, stars. You carved a bird with wings spread wide and placed it above the door. You carved a fox with bared teeth and set it near the fire. You carved your own hands, cracked, tired, open. You never returned to the towns, never watched another hanging, never touched another blade. You let the memories come and go like weather storm and sun, frost and thaw. You no longer hid from them. You listened. You endured. You grew older. The forest did too. Vines climbed the cabin walls like quiet offerings. The river shifted, carving new paths through the earth. And one morning, you woke to silence, not the silence of death, but the silence of acceptance. You stepped outside barefoot. The grass was damp. The sun broke through the trees like gold pouring from a cracked bowl. You breathed in, deep, unafraid, unforgiven, unfinished, but free. The days in the forest began to follow a rhythm so slow, so soft, you almost forgot there was a world beyond the trees. The sun rose gently, as if asking permission. The wind moved with purpose, but without urgency. Your hands no longer trembled. Not because the memories were gone, but because you no longer resisted them. They came like birds now, sometimes loud, sometimes silent, but always passing through. You made peace with their presence. You stopped carving faces. That part of you had burned with the axe, but the shapes you made now felt like breathing, simple, instinctive, necessary. You hung some above the door, others you placed at the riverbank, half buried in stone and moss. They weren't idols. They weren't prayers. They were acknowledgments. Markers of a man who had done terrible things and still woke up each day trying not to vanish. One morning, you heard voices, distant but not imagined. Travelers, pilgrims maybe. Their laughter carried too easily through the trees. You watched from behind the birch trees, unseen. One of them, young, maybe 16, stopped to drink from the river. His hands shook, not from cold, but from fear. You recognized that tremor. The same one that haunted you for years. The same one you used to watch settle into the condemned before the rope took their breath. You almost stepped out, almost spoke, but you didn't. You weren't a healer. You weren't a guide. You were just a shadow now. A quiet ghost with skin. They passed. The boy looked back once, eyes scanning the trees, and you wondered if he'd sensed you. If fear recognized itself across distance. You returned to your cabin, sat beside the fire, and stared at the bird carving above your door. It had begun to darken with soot, feathers curling at the edges from the heat. You didn't move it. Let it blacken. Let it become something new. That night, a storm rolled in. No lightning, no thunder, just endless rain, steady and insistent, like the forest itself was crying in secret. You listened to it hit the roof, drip through the cracks, soak the stones outside. You didn't sleep. You watched the fire shrink, and remembered a face not from the scaffold, not from the prison, but from your childhood. A man in a cloak with a crooked smile who once told your father, "Mercy costs more than blood." You hadn't understood then, but now, sitting alone, you did. Mercy wasn't given, it was taken, chosen, carried. And it was heavy. You had never been shown mercy. But in leaving, in walking away, in not raising the axe again, you had offered it. To yourself, to the world. You built a small garden in spring. Nothing grew easily in the soil. Too many roots, too little light. But you tried. On your knees, palms in the dirt, fingernails packed with mud, you worked in silence. Lettuce, onion, something bitter and leafy whose name you never learned. They didn't always survive, but some did. And when they did, you ate them with reverence. You remembered every meal you'd been forced to swallow while someone's blood cooled nearby. You remembered the taste of iron that clung to your tongue no matter what you ate. Now, your meals were silent, slow, ritual. A slice of root, a pinch of salt, water from the river poured with both hands. You didn't say grace. You didn't believe in that. But you bowed your head anyway. The earth didn't ask for thanks, but you gave it, because it had given you silence, and in silence you had found something close to meaning. You began to dream less of ropes, and more of trees, of leaves that sang when the wind moved through them, of birds nesting in the eaves of your cabin, of nothing even. And nothing, after all those years, felt like salvation. Once, during a red dusk, you found a bird with a broken wing near the stream. You knelt slowly, whispering nonsense words as you cupped it in your hands. It didn't fight, just blinked up at you. You carried it home, built a sling from bark and cloth, placed it on the shelf beside the fire. Each morning it pecked its seeds with quiet urgency. Each night, it tucked its head beneath its wing and slept. When the wing healed, you left the window open. For days it didn't leave, then one morning it was gone. You didn't search for it. You didn't mourn. It had healed and left. You sat at the window with an empty hand and realized so had you. Not fully, not forever, but enough. Enough to stay. Enough to let the sun touch your face without flinching. You wrote your name once, on the back of a flat stone, not the name they gave you in the town, not the one etched into the records of executions and sentences. Your real name, the one your mother whispered when she held you as a child. You wrote it, stared at it, then dropped the stone into the river, watched it vanish. You smiled, not because you were erasing yourself, because you were finally remembering. You stopped counting the years, your hair grayed, your hands slowed, but the forest did not reject you. It accepted your silence. It embraced your weariness. You walked each morning to the same clearing, leaned against the same rock, and listened to the wind move through the tall grass. Some days, it whispered. Some days, it roared. And some days, it called no sound at all. You answered anyway, not with words. Just by being there, you'd become part of the land. A branch, a root, a stone that once knew fire but now only felt rain. In the evenings, you lit a single candle. Let the shadows move across the walls, like memories you no longer feared. You spoke aloud sometimes, not to the dead, not to the trees, to yourself, practicing the softness of your voice, reclaiming the sound. You said simple things. I am here. The fire is warm. The night is long. But I remain. And that was enough. The mornings grew colder. Not sharply, not suddenly, but with the slow insistence of time making its way through bones. You felt it first in your fingers, then your knees, then in the breath you let out as mist before the sun found you. The cabin creaked differently in the cold. The roof sighed. The walls shrank. The fire became not a comfort, but a necessity. You moved slower, chopped less wood, ate smaller meals, but you remained. The trees around you had grown since the day you arrived. You'd watch them stretch skyward, watch their trunks thicken, their bark crack and deepen. They bore witness to your stillness, and in turn, you bore witness to their movement. You began to speak their names, not names you'd learned, but names you gave them. The tall one near the stream you called the Watcher. The twisted one behind the cabin, Old Hand. The one whose roots curled like knuckles above the soil, the Keeper. These trees were not friends, but they were something close to companions. The bird never returned, but sometimes others came. Sparrows, jays. A hawk once, its wings span like a shadow passing over your firewood. You never tried to catch them, just watched. Let them be. You had no need to hold anymore. No need to own. The days shortened. The frost crept closer. You layered furs you hadn't touched in years, dug deeper into the stores you'd gathered in late summer. Root vegetables, dried mushrooms, a few strips of salted meat. You rationed carefully, not out of fear, but out of discipline. You had learned over the years the difference between survival and hoarding. Between preparing and hiding. You were not hiding. Not anymore. One night, as the snow began to fall for the first time that season, you sat by the fire and took out a scrap of parchment. You hadn't written in years. Not since you'd carved your name into that stone and let the river swallow it. But tonight felt different. Not final. Just full. Full enough to spill. You dipped a crude nib into soot and water and wrote 5 words. I forgive the broken man. You didn't sign it. You didn't need to. You folded the paper, placed it beneath the bird carving above the door, and let the fire burn lower than usual. Sleep came easily, deeply, like water pulling you under but gently. When you woke, the snow was thick on the roof. The trees groaned with its weight. The river moved slower, choked by ice. You took your time gathering kindling, careful with your steps, hands stiff but sure. Every movement had become a ceremony. Not because you feared death, but because you understood its language now. The slowing of the body, the loosening of the voice, the softness of breath. You heard it in yourself. You heard it in the forest. The world was not dying. It was resting. One day, while gathering fallen limbs for the fire, you came across a boy no older than 10, curled beneath a bush, half covered in frost. His lips were blue, his hands scraped and bloody. He had no shoes. You carried him back to the cabin without thinking, bundled him in every spare cloth you had, fed him broth with shaking hands. He didn't speak for 3 days, just stared at the walls, eyes wide with something you knew too well, memory that had no words. You didn't ask. You didn't press. You waited. On the 4th night, he whispered, "They burned everything." You nodded. He said no more, but you both understood. You let him sleep near the fire, gave him the bed. You took the floor. In the mornings, you taught him to gather bark, to boil water, to watch the sky. He never asked your name. You never asked his. Names were for those who needed to be remembered. You had both spent too long being remembered for the wrong things. He stayed through the winter. You watched the color return to his cheeks, watched the weight return to his limbs. He carved his own shapes into bark birds mostly. You didn't comment, just gave him space. Come spring, he asked if he could leave. You said yes, packed him a sack of food, wrapped his small blade in oilcloth, pressed your palm to his chest once, just once, and said, "Survive gently." He nodded and disappeared into the trees without looking back. You didn't expect him to. You stood there long after, hands still raised, breath slow. Not sad, not empty, just still. Later that week, you found one of his carvings beside the river. A bird with broken wings, perched on a branch. You left it there. Let the moss take it. The seasons continued. Your joints ached louder. Your breath came shallower, but you moved still. You fetched water, fed the fire, carved slowly, not to finish, but to remember how. One night, you dreamed of the square again. The scaffold, the rope, the people. But it was silent. No cries, no shouts. Just the creak of wood and the wind in your ears. You stood beside the gallows, but no one hung. The platform was empty, clean. You turned to leave, and the crowd parted without sound. No eyes, no judgment, just silence. When you woke, the cabin felt warmer, not from fire, from memory. It had finally quieted. You knew then that the end was near, not in dread, in rhythm. Like the last page of a long letter, folding into itself. You lit the candle early, wrote nothing, spoke nothing, just sat, listened. The trees whispered, the river moved, the wind tugged gently at the roof. And you, old man, former executioner, shadow made of flesh, closed your eyes not in fear, but in thanks, because you had once taken lives, and had somehow, impossibly, made peace with your own. The village barely remembered him. The stories that once buzzed like flies around the scaffold had faded with the passing of mouths that carried them. A child once whispered to another near the well that there had been a man who lived with the trees, who never came to town, who wore black even in spring, but the older ones shook their heads. A ghost, they said. A myth. Others added. No one said his name, because no one was certain they'd known it to begin with. Years had passed since he'd last walked among them. Enough time for roads to change, for roofs to sag, for graves to settle under the weight of moss and silence. A new gallows had been built, farther from the center of town, cleaner, taller, its ropes unused because the new lawman preferred exile, preferred punishment without spectacle. It was said he had found a journal once, buried in a locked chest behind the old stone jail. A journal written in tight, careful script, with passages that spoke of sleepless nights, of blood-soaked mornings, of hands that shook even after the axe had fallen. The lawman never spoke of it, but some claimed he kept the journal on a shelf behind his desk, spine unmarked, but pages turned, again and again. In that village, the name of the polish was a flea, cur, a shadow caught in the eye's edge. A memory too soft to disturb the dust. But farther away, across a river that ran colder than most, and through a forest too thick to map, a small cabin still stood. empty now, though not abandoned. Inside, the fire had long since died, and the walls smelled of old smoke and dry bark. The bird carving above the door had turned entirely black. The tips of its wings curled inward as if bracing against a wind that never came. A single wooden figure sat on the shelf, its shape simple, familiar. A man seated, hands open, no rope, no blade, just stillness. Travelers passed it sometimes, those lost or avoiding things. The cabin gave them shelter. No door barred them. No lock turned against their hands. Inside, they found silence and warmth if they lit the fire again. Some said they felt watched. Others said they slept better there than they had in years. One man left a drawing behind just charcoal on wood, of a tree with a noose hanging empty. Another woman buried a locket beneath the hearth, wrapped in cloth. No one stayed long, but each left something, a gesture, a token, a word, because the space, though quiet, felt held, as if the air remembered grief, and did not judge it. In time, a path formed from the trodden earth, soft and narrow, winding through birch and pine. No signs marked it, no maps recorded it, but it remained. Because people, even when they try to forget, still follow what makes them feel known. And that place, once home to a man with ash on his hands and silence in his chest, had become a haven not from judgment, but from memory. In a town days away, a boy now grown kept a carving tucked beneath his bed. A bird, wings slightly bent, tail unfinished. He didn't know why he kept it. Couldn't remember the face of the man who had placed it in his satchel years ago. But he knew the weight of it mattered. Knew it had been given, not taken, and that made it sacred. He became a carpenter, not by trade but by rhythm. His hands found wood the way some men find prayer. Not to build homes, but to shape silence. In another city, a scholar uncovered documents in a ruined priory. Lists of executions, dates, locations. Among them, a name crossed out again and again, as if the parchment itself refused to carry it. But beside it, someone had written, "He wept afterward." The scholar underlined it, not for record, but for understanding. Because even the hand that delivers death may tremble at what it's done. Because even in ink, there is mercy. And in that mercy, memory survives. Somewhere in the hills, an old tree bore marks too deliberate to be weathered. Not initials, not symbols, just grooves, deep and even, made by someone who knew how to strike clean. Snow gathered in them in winter. Rain followed their lines in spring. Children touched them in summer, wondering who had carved them. And always, they felt cold, not cruel, just cold, like the truth too many years forgotten. The Palach was no longer a man, he was pattern. Echo, a shape in the forest, a silence that spoke to the weary. His death had not been grand, had not been noticed. He had lain down one night as the stars shimmered faintly through the cracks in his roof. He had closed his eyes not from exhaustion, but from peace. And when the breath left him, it did so quietly, like a candle accepting wind. No witness, no right. Just the forest holding him, the earth softening beneath him. He became the soil, the tree root, the shadow that doesn't move when the wind does. He had been feared. He had been hated. But he had also walked away, chosen stillness over steel, and in doing so, had become something very rare. A man who had taken life, and then, in the end, given it back. Not with blade, but with quiet. With years lived without harm. With a silence that welcomed others. In a tavern far from any city, a song was once sung of a man in black who carried his guilt like a torch through the trees, lighting the way for others to lay theirs down. Most laughed, said it was just a tale, but a woman in the corner, older than most, smiled. Because she had once seen that man, when she was a girl lost and cold, and he had given her fire. Not a word, not a name, just warmth. And that warmth had never left her. The executioner was gone, but he had not vanished. He had been made into wood, into snow, into stories spoken low near fires by those who understood that mercy is a long road, and sometimes the ones who walk it must do so alone. until they are not alone anymore. The dream came to the blacksmith every third night without fail. It did not shift or grow hazy with time. It remained exact, etched into his sleep like a scar that refused to fade. In the dream, he stood in a vast clearing beneath a slate-colored sky. Before him, a man sat cross-legged in the snow, wearing no cloak, no boots, no warmth, and yet he did not shiver. His skin was pale but not lifeless, his beard dark and threaded with silver. He did not speak. He only okayed, and in his eyes was something the blacksmith could never name, something older than pity and colder than rage. Each time the blacksmith awoke with his hands clenched, his knuckles white and aching. He would sit on the edge of his bed and whisper, "Forgive me," to no one. Because long ago as a boy, he had cheered as the axe fell. He had stood among the crowd, shouting, not knowing what he was shouting for, only that the world had pointed at the man in black and told him he was evil. The blacksmith, now an old man, knew better. He had forged tools, weapons, hinges, and chains. He had seen what it took to break a thing, and he had begun to understand what it took to carry the weight of that breaking. Elsewhere, in a convent tucked deep in the hills, a nun carried a folded scrap of parchment in the lining of her robe. It bore 5 words in crude, fading ink. "I forgive the broken man." She had found it wedged inside a rotting beam of a ruined cabin she'd sought shelter in during a storm. The parchment had been dry, untouched by rain, as though protected by something unseen. She read it often, not for meaning, but for presence. When her hands trembled from cold or grief, she would press her fingers to the paper and feel steadier. She never told the other sisters. They spoke of saints and relics, of miracles performed by those whose names history honored. But this paper, this unknown message left behind in silence, felt holier to her than any gilded cross. In a stone quarry at the edge of a frozen valley, laborers whispered about a figure who had once stood watching them from the tree line at dusk. Cloaked, unmoving, silent. Some said it was a ghost. Others claimed it was a guardian. The truth didn't matter. What mattered was that since then, they left bread and salt on a flat rock near the edge of the forest. And the bread was always gone by morning. One man swore he'd seen boot prints in the snow, leading away, never toward. No one followed them. Not out of fear, but respect. Because some shadows deserve peace. Deep underground, in a cathedral crypt where the bones of nobles were stacked like books, a priest cataloged relics with careful hands. Among chalices and scraps of velvet, he found a single wooden disc, smooth and pale, carved with a symbol none could place. A rope coiled like a sleeping serpent. Around it, a circle. No one claimed it. It did not appear in any records. But the priest kept it in his study, placed upon a shelf above his desk. He said it calmed him, said the air around it felt clean, even in a room thick with decay. In the capital, a play was written, not by a nobleman nor a scribe, but by a beggar who scribbled lines in the dust with a stick. A young actor found it, memorized it, and turned it into a performance. The story was simple. A man tasked with death who longs to become invisible. The crowd didn't cheer. They didn't weep. They sat, silent, and when the final lines were spoken, he did not vanish. He walked away. They remained still for a long while before dispersing. No one asked for the actor's name, but the play was whispered about, passed on, changed with each telling. Because stories, when they survive, do so not in ink or parchment, but in breath. And breath moves differently when carrying grief. In the northern provinces, mothers told their children not to wander too far into the woods, not because of wolves, but because the man with no voice watched from the trees. He wouldn't harm them, they said, but he remembered every wrong they ever did. Children would look over their shoulders when stealing apples or stepping on ants, their eyes scanning the shadows for a glimpse of a figure still as bark, darker than dusk. This fear wasn't cruel, it was soft. A caution wrapped in old cloth. Because even the executioner, they believed, had once been a child, had once wept, had once listened to the silence between the cries. And maybe, just maybe, he still did. One day, a letter arrived at the edge of a town that had forgotten it still received letters. No name, just a sealed envelope bearing the symbol of a broken scale. Inside, a single sentence. There was no justice, only duty. No one claimed authorship, but the mayor kept it pinned to the back of his door. Read it each morning. Said nothing about it to anyone. And slowly, decisions in that town grew gentler. Punishments shortened. Second chances offered more freely. In a harbor city drenched in rain and salt, a ship's captain told his crew to always light a lantern at the stern, even in calm waters. For the watcher, he said. For the one who stood alone, the sailors laughed but obeyed. And more than once, ships in the distance blinked their lanterns in response 3 slow flashes. No signal code matched it, but those who saw it didn't forget. Because sometimes, across miles of dark water, something sees you and chooses not to look away. All across the land, these echoes lived, not connected, not documented, just scattered like seeds. No shrine was built, no monument erected. But in every act of quiet mercy, every decision to walk away from cruelty, every moment someone chose to carry their guilt instead of discarding it, he lived, the man with the axe, the man with the silence, the man who once broke and chose not to again. They had called him Palash, but he had become something else entirely, a whisper inside the conscience of the world. And the whisper, it seemed, was growing louder. In a village built upon a river that no longer flowed, old women told stories to children too young to know fear. They spoke in soft voices, almost like lullabies, of a man who carried the weight of others' sins so that they would not have to. His face changed with every telling, sometimes bearded, sometimes scarred, sometimes so gentle it made the children frown in confusion. But one detail never changed. He never spoke. In the stories, he arrived when someone cried alone. He stood by the bed of the grieving, or watched from the forest edge when anger threatened to spill into violence. He did nothing, said nothing, but his presence shifted the air, calmed the trembling, quieted the hand raised in fury. One child, wide-eyed and trembling beneath a woven blanket, asked, "Did he ever speak?" The woman shook her head. He didn't need to. His silence was enough. And as the children drifted into sleep, the lantern in the corner flickered just slightly, though the windows were closed and no wind stirred. In a ruined abbey near the cliffs, a monk rebuilt the fallen stones not out of faith, but remembrance. He had once been a soldier, had once dragged a man in chains through muddy streets while others spat. That man had looked at him not with hatred, not with fear, but with pity. The soldier never forgot that gaze. Years later, when his sword had rusted and his hands had grown too slow for war, he found the abbey by accident. Or perhaps not by accident at all. Among the stones, he unearthed a fragment of a wooden beam, its surface blackened but intact. On it, faintly, the outline of a bird's wing carved, not for beauty, but purpose. He buried it beneath the altar, said no prayers, just bowed his head as if in apology, and continued rebuilding, not for God, but for the broken, for the forgotten. In a portside tavern weathered by salt and time, a fisherman told a tale after too many drinks. He swore that once, when lost in fog near the reefs, he'd seen a man standing atop the water, not walking, not floating, just there, watching. He'd blinked, and the figure vanished, but when he docked, a single feather lay in his boat, coated in soot. He kept it in a jar, not for proof, but for peace. In a city where names changed hands more often than coin, a child orphaned by plague found an old satchel beneath a staircase. Inside, a cloth bundle, a worn journal, and a blade wrapped in leather. Not a weapon. Not anymore. The child never opened the journal, could not read, but he slept with it under his head. The leather blade remained by the door, and though the city teemed with thieves, no one ever touched it. Some claimed the satchel carried a curse. Others said it smelled of ash and sorrow. The boy grew into a man, never learned to read. but he became the one others came to when they had nowhere else. He never asked questions. He only listened, and he never turned anyone away. In the eastern mountains, where the snow-buried paths and time itself seemed to slow, an old woman carved symbols into wood. Circles, ropes, eyes closed in sleep. She said she dreamed them. Said a man in black visited her in her dreams and showed her what needed to be remembered. She gave the carvings to travelers. "He's watching," she'd whisper, "but not in the way you fear." And some swore that after keeping the tokens closed, they began to sleep more deeply, breathe more easily, forgive more quickly. In a forest so dense it swallowed sound, a deer path wound past a stone with strange markings, slashes, and notches in rhythmic patterns. Hunters left offerings here, not for gods, but for balance. None knew who made the stone, but all who walked by felt it, that something had happened there, something final, something necessary. The markings could have been made by any tool, but they were not. They were made by hands that knew what it meant to cut and what it cost. In a school where history was written by those who'd never touched a sword, a teacher paused one morning and told her students a different story, not of kings or saints, but of a man who bore the sins of the world until they nearly crushed him. She didn't use the word executioner. Didn't need to. The students listened, breath held, as she described how he walked away from death, how he disappeared not into legend but into mercy. One student asked, "Was he real?" She replied, "Does it matter? He is now." On a battlefield that had once been holy ground, ravaged by war and left to rot, a single tree grew taller than the rest. Its bark bore deep scars, as though struck repeatedly long ago. No one remembered who had fought there, but every spring, blood-red flowers bloomed at the base of the tree, and soldiers who passed through left tokens, buttons, rings, scraps of cloth, not to honor victory, but to mourn the burden of obedience. Because somewhere, someone had once chosen to stop obeying, and that decision echoed louder than any trumpet. In the deep night, when the world held its breath, a traveler sometimes glimpsed a shadow beside their fire. Not close, not threatening, just present, a silhouette with a stillness too deliberate to be accident. They did not run, they did not speak. And when morning came, nothing remained except a sense of being seen, not judged, not pitied, just known. In that knowing was a strange kind of absolution, a silent voice that whispered, "You're not the only one carrying weight." And the traveler, whatever their path, walked lighter. Somewhere in the world, a river split into two. One path ran fast, loud, cutting through rock. The other meandered, slow and quiet, winding through valleys and forests. People flocked to the loud river, built mills and cities beside it. But the quiet river held a secret. If you sat beside it long enough, in the hour before dawn, the water whispered a name. Not loudly, not clearly, just enough for the heart to recognize. That name had once belonged to a man. Now, it belonged to the silence he left behind. The executioner had not become legend. He had become something softer, something truer. A pause before anger, a hesitation before cruelty, a hand lowered, a voice quieted. He had become the breath the world took between violence and grace. And though no statue bore his likeness, and no song carried his tale in chorus, he endured, in whispers, in shadows, in mercy. The role of the executioner did not end when the axe was lowered for the last time, nor did it vanish with the passing of a single man or a forgotten name etched on a crumbling gravestone outside the church wall. Instead, it lingered in quieter places, in the laws left unwritten, in the punishments never carried out again, in the faces of those who turned away from violence not because they were weak, but because they had once stared it down and survived. The executioner, once a man with a blade and a burden, became a concept too heavy to carry and too necessary to forget. Across kingdoms and provinces, as the gallows were dismantled and the public squares repaved, his presence faded not with disgrace, but with fatigue. People no longer cheered for death. They simply wanted to stop remembering it. They built walls around their justice, made it procedural, distant, clerical. But inside every court, behind every sentence, the ghost of a man in black still sat at the edge of memory, not judging, not forgiving, just reminding. In the high courts of the new cities, where powdered wigs replaced bloodied hoods, decisions were signed with ink instead of iron. But every so often, a judge would pause before delivering a verdict and feel, inexplicably, the weight of unseen eyes. Not the eyes of the accused, not the eyes of the crowd. Eyes that knew what came after, that remembered the silence following a final breath. Those judges rarely admitted it aloud, but some left their robes at the end of a case and never returned. Said they'd heard a whisper no one else had. Said it told them, "You understand now." In churches where sins were cataloged like debts and absolutions sold like relics, the memory of the executioner returned in twisted forms. He became a metaphor for wrath, for hell, for divine punishment. Priests painted him as a warning, his axe raised not by duty, but by vengeance. But older monks, the ones who spoke less and listened more, told different stories. They described a man who bore what others refused to carry. A soul who walked through fire not to punish, but to make sure others never had to step into it. They called him not a servant of wrath, but of sorrow. And in the quiet hours of early prayer, they whispered his name like a prayer of their own, one not for salvation, but for strength. In the folklore of the countryside, he shifted again, became a figure who knocked once on the door of those who carried secrets. He did not speak. He did not enter. But if you opened the door, you found a candle burning in your hearth and a blade laid gently across your threshold. Not to threaten, to remind that some truths demand acknowledgement, and some guilt can only be lived with, not erased. Children dared one another to say his name at night. They never did. Not out of terror, but reverence. Because even in games, there were lines one did not cross. The old songs of traveling bards rarely mentioned him directly, but their verses carried his weight. They sang of men who stood alone, of choices no one else would make, of burdens that bent backs and silenced voices. They sang of silence not as emptiness, but as meaning too vast for words. The audience would listen, eyes glassy, hands still. And when the song ended, they would sit for a moment before clapping, because the echo of the executioner's life was not something one applauded. It was something one felt deep in the chest, like a bruise where grief had once lived. In the margins of banned books, scribes doodled images they would never admit to drawing hooded men with tired eyes, scales that hung forever unbalanced, hands open and empty. These symbols made their way into secret codes, into hidden corners of walls, into dreams. Because even in forgetting, something inside remembered. In the great libraries, where history was rewritten by victors, the executioner's name was redacted, his records sealed or burned, his descendants, if any, erased. Not because he was hated, but because he made the world uncomfortable. Because he stood at the intersection of law and death, duty and despair, and no empire wanted to admit what it had demanded from him. It was easier to pretend he never existed, to tell simpler stories, to cast villains and heroes in clean lines, forgetting the man who stood in shadow, bearing the worst so others could pretend to be good. Yet in art, he remained, not always by name, but in shape, in posture, in the way light never quite touched the figure in the corner of the painting, in the way statues looked away, hand clenched around something unseen. In the way plays paused just long enough before the final line to let the audience feel the weight of something unspoken. He became part of the grammar of sorrow, a punctuation mark at the end of grief. And even as the world changed, metal gave way to stone, and stone to paper, and paper to circuits he endured, not in data, but in pause, in silence, in the breath between action and regret, in the decision to stop the blade. To look the other way, not from cowardice, but from choice. The medieval executioner did not vanish. He diffused, dissolved into culture, became a cautionary tale, not of cruelty, but of consequence. He stood behind the man raising his voice too loudly. He lingered in the hallway where someone considered revenge. He watched from the stairwell as a woman chose to walk away instead of scream. He became the part of every person that remembered what breaking felt like and decided not to inflict it again. In small towns, cobblers and butchers and apothecaries had dreams they could not explain. Dreams of snow falling silently on a field of wooden posts, of a figure walking alone across an empty courtyard, of a rope that uncoiled itself, slowly, with purpose. These dreams left them tired, hollowed out, and more patient with their neighbors. In cities, those who worked with the dying doctors, nurses, morticians kept black feathers in their pockets. No one knew where the feathers came from. They just appeared, and no one questioned it, because to carry one felt like armor, like penance, like memory. In the cold corners of prisons where guards walked nightly patrols, some left small pieces of bread on the windowsills. Rats didn't eat them, birds didn't take them, but they were always gone by morning. And somehow, the prisoners slept better those nights. Not because justice was present, but because someone had remembered the cost of delivering it. Somewhere, far from the cities and courts and markets, a tree stood alone on a hill where the wind never ceased. At its base, a stone slab bore no name, no date, only a single carved line, the impression of a hand, pressed deep into the granite. No one claimed to know whose it was, but travelers stopped there, placed their hand inside the impression, closed their eyes, and exhaled. And in that breath, they left behind something heavy, something sharp, something they no longer needed to carry. Because the executioner had already borne it once, and now, through memory, legend, and silence, he bore it again. A child once asked his grandmother why the statues in the village square had no faces. The stone busts weathered, hollow-eyed, their mouths, worn away, looked like ghosts. She told him they were carved that way on purpose, not because the sculptor forgot the details, but because some people carried rolls so heavy that to remember their features was to feel their pain again. One of those faceless statues, she whispered, had once been a man who held justice in his hands not in a courtroom, but in the trembling instant between guilt and steel. The child didn't understand then, but years later, when he became a man who held papers signed with final sentences, he would sometimes dream of a hooded figure standing silently in a storm, and he would wake with the taste of metal in his mouth and the urge to apologize to someone he couldn't name. Across distant provinces, oral histories drifted like smoke, unsourced, unclaimed, but carried from mouth to mouth with a cadence of warnings disguised as lullabies. A woman weaving baskets told her niece of the man who could not forget. A miller, drunk near sleep, told his grandson that mercy came in the shape of a hood and silence. A merchant, aging and bitter, confessed to a stranger that when he was a boy, he'd watched a man walk away from a crowd, blood on his hands, no one daring to follow. And though no one named the figure outright, everyone knew who it was meant to be. The executioner did not need a name anymore. He had become the shape that stories filled. In dark manuscripts, buried in monastic vaults, illuminations showed men kneeling in confession, not before crosses or saints, but before empty thrones, or cloaked shadows with hands extended not in punishment, but in witness. The monks who copied these pages were warned not to dwell too long on their meaning, yet many did. Some grew quiet, others left the orders altogether, claiming that silence was more sacred than scripture. In the growing towns of the post-feudal age, artists and writers searched for symbols to express the violence of their lineage. They found him again. The executioner appeared in allegory and poem, in tragic play, and grotesque caricature. He was the fool made wise by blood, the outcast who saw too much, the blade that trembled before falling. His image split across forms sometimes holy, sometimes monstrous, but always bearing eyes that saw through the veil of pretense. For the common folk, he became an emblem not of fear, but of clarity, a reminder that power always demands a price, and that someone, somewhere, is left holding the weight no one else will touch. In dusty libraries untouched by war, Librarians found annotations in the margins of forgotten law books, notes written not by scholars but by those who had witnessed death too closely. He did not flinch. The child watched. Mercy was denied that day. These notes were unsigned, but their tone was unmistakable. Calm, mournful, reverent. They bore no anger, no outrage. Only record. As if someone, long ago, decided that even when justice was deaf, memory must not be. In villages built atop the ruins of plague and revolt, old wells bore carvings no one recognized. Circles intersected with ropes. Eyes closed. Birds with wings drooped. Scholars dismissed them as folk art, but those who lived nearby knew better. Children avoided the wells at dusk. Travelers left coins beside them. The air around those stones never moved, even in wind. And sometimes, if you placed your ear to the moss-covered edge, you could swear you heard breathing. Not deep, not threatening, just present, enduring. In the rituals of midwives, who stood between life and death without armor or altar, the executioner became an unseen patron. When blood came too fast or silence fell too long, some whispered to him not in prayer, but in recognition. He too had held the line between this world and whatever came next. He too had watched eyes close and never open again. And though they never lit candles in his name, they lit them anyway. Not because they believed he would intercede, but because he had already borne witness. Somewhere in a northern forest, frozen half the year, a family passed down a cloak. It was too heavy for comfort, too coarse for fashion, but no one dared throw it away. They said it had been worn by a man who did something so terrible, so necessary, that the weight of it never faded. Generations wore it during funerals, during storms, during war. Each time, they said it kept them warm in ways fire could not. The fabric smelled of smoke and iron, and silence. In certain border towns where languages blurred and loyalties shifted with the wind, a mark was scratched above the doors of inns and watchtowers 2 lines, one vertical, one slashed across. No one claimed to know what it meant, but no soldier who saw it ever knocked. They said it was an old sign, a warning or a promise. That inside was someone who had seen death and chosen not to serve it again. In places where executions were abolished, where gallows rotted and laws rewrote themselves, a strange thing happened. Crime did not vanish, but the appetite for spectacle did. People no longer gathered to watch suffering. They turned away, closed shutters, walked faster past tragedy. Not because they'd become kinder, but because, buried somewhere deep, a lesson had taken root. One man long ago had shown them what it meant to see too much. And now, they avoided seeing it all. In that avoidance was a kind of inheritance. In academies and universities, philosophers debated justice in sanitized terms. But in quiet moments between lectures, after wine, they admitted that all theories failed at the moment of death, that no logic could reconcile the trembling hand, the final breath, and though they did not cite him in their footnotes, they sometimes ended their essays with a single word: silence. In graveyards where tombstones leaned like weary men, a few bore no names, just a carved hood, or a feather, or a rope knotted but frayed. These graves were tended without payment. Flowers appeared without witness. And though the names were forgotten, the roles were not. These were not graves of kings or knights, but someone just as important, someone who had held the blade not for glory, but because someone had to, and someone always does. In dreams that lingered long after waking, people saw him walking away not from gallows, but from crowds. Not from bodies, but from judgment. Always alone, never pursued, because deep down, the world knew. It had asked him to do what it could not face, and now it could not look at him without seeing its own reflection. He was not haunted. He was the haunting, not a ghost, but a mirror. And in every act of hesitation, every stayed hand, every word softened instead of shouted, he lived again, not as memory, but as presence, as conscience, as the quiet step taken back from the edge. The executioner was gone, but his echo remained. In the architecture of mercy, in the redesign of justice, in the spaces where we choose silence over spectacle, compassion over certainty. He had been made to be forgotten, but the world had failed. Because some things, once carried, cannot be dropped. Some roles, once born, reshape the soul of history itself. They buried him in a field no one claimed. No church blessed the ground. No mourners stood beside the hole. Just a shovel, just the wind. Just the man who dug and the man he placed into the earth. The body had been washed, not ceremoniously, but carefully. Not because anyone cared, but because something about him demanded it. As if even in death, the executioner's presence insisted on precision, on respect. The man who dug an old gravedigger with more ghosts than family whispered an apology when the last clod of dirt fell. He didn't know why, only that it felt right. He never marked the grave, didn't need to. He would remember, and that was enough. But in the decades that followed, others found their way there. Pilgrims of no particular faith, travelers who followed no road. They claimed no kinship with the man beneath the soil, yet they came, sat, waited, spoke into the silence. Not prayers, not questions, just presence. As if the earth there listened differently, breathed slower, understood. And when they left, they always walked lighter. In nearby towns, the people never spoke of the grave, but they knew of it. Children were told not to play in that field, not out of fear, but because it was not for laughter. And the few who did wander there returned, changed, quiet, thoughtful, as if they had heard a story without words. As if they had met someone who no longer needed to speak to be understood. Over time, the field grew wilder. Flowers bloomed where no seeds were sown. Birds nested in silence. No predators came. It was not holy, not cursed, just watched, just remembered. In distant cities, long after the gallows had been pulled down and the laws rewritten, a strange fashion emerged. Black bands tied around the left wrist, worn by no one specific, adopted by no trend. It began with soldiers, the judges, then mothers who had lost children, then children who had survived something they could not name. They never explained why. Only that it felt like armor, like acknowledgement, like a signal to the world that they, too, had carried a weight. And others recognized it, nodded, moved aside, gave space. No one called it a tribute, but it was. Deep in the archives of old cities, where dust hung like memory and paper crumbled beneath breath, historians stumbled on fragments, letters unsigned, pages torn from journals, sketches on parchment, all bearing one thing in common: a hooded figure, standing in profile, always walking away. No face, no name, no explanation. Yet across languages and lifetimes he appeared, again and again. As if the ink remembered what the mind chose to forget. In theaters lit by candlelight, plays emerged that dared to tell the truth. Not about kings or heroes, but about the man who stood in shadow, who took no joy in his duty, no comfort in his absolution. These plays ended not with applause, but with silence. Audiences sat frozen, breath held, as if waiting for something that never came. And when the lights returned, they looked at one another differently, as if each had glimpsed something they didn't have the words for, as if they had seen the executioner, and in him, seen themselves. In small shrines where saints were never canonized, tokens were left: a black feather, a broken chain, a stone, smooth and warm from a closed fist. No one claimed these offerings, no priest collected them, but the pile grew, slowly, steadily, as if the world needed a place to put the weight it could no longer carry alone. A place to leave the pain handed down through generations, not to erase it, but to let it rest. In villages built atop the ruins of old kingdoms, storytellers began their tales not with once upon a time, but with "there was a man." And every listener knew who they meant, even before the blade, even before the sentence. They knew, because the man was never just a man. He was the consequence, the reckoning, the reminder. And though the stories changed, the shape of him remained. Alone, watching, carrying. In distant academies, where students debated ethics and justice, a question always returned: who bears the cost? And though textbooks offered clean answers, the students who had felt loss, who had seen injustice, who had stood at the edge of decision, they answered differently, quietly, with a name never spoken but deeply known, the executioner, the one who had no choice, and yet chose to carry it anyway. In dreams passed down like inheritance, people saw a man walking through snow that left no footprints, a man who turned but had no face, a man who offered nothing but presence, and in that presence, a kind of peace. Not forgiveness, not absolution, just peace. The kind that says, "You're not alone." The kind that says, "I bore it too." In forgotten corners of cathedrals, where candle wax pooled like time and footsteps dared not echo, a single stone bore an etching. 2 hands, open, no sword, no scales, just hands. Beneath it, the words, "I was here." No one knows who carved it, but every so often, someone places a piece of cloth there, black, frayed, heavy with meaning, and walks away lighter. Across generations, the executioner faded not into oblivion, but into us, into every quiet act of mercy, into every hand held instead of struck, into every moment where vengeance was possible but not chosen. He became the pause, the sigh, the wait. And through that, the world changed not by erasing him, but by remembering what he taught without teaching. That justice without compassion is cruelty. That duty without humanity is damnation. And that someone must always bear witness, even when no one else dares. His grave remains unmarked, but his story is written in every gesture of grace, in every trembling decision made not to harm, in every silence that says, "I understand." And though his name is lost, he is not. He is here, still, always, in us. There was a time when people stopped remembering the executioner as a man. They remembered him as a shape, a presence, a black outline on the edge of a torchlit memory. In the old villages, where the gallows had long been swallowed by grass and fog, the figure of the executioner became something else entirely. Not a role, not a person, but a whisper passed between generations. They said he appeared when justice was wounded and not yet dead. That if you listened carefully in courtrooms or in the homes of grieving families, you might hear his footsteps just outside the door, never coming in, never leaving, just waiting. They didn't draw him with features anymore, only with posture, always hunched. Not from shame, but from weight. He was always holding something unseen, and always it was too heavy for anyone else. The myths grew. In one town, children whispered that if you lied too many times, the man with the rope in his hands would come not to punish age, but to listen, and he would say nothing. Just look at you until you confessed. In another, it was said that if you stole food, a shadow would sit at your table for 7 nights, eating nothing, saying nothing, until your appetite vanished. And still elsewhere, a story told of a woman who had betrayed her sister. At night, she dreamed of a man standing beside her bed, hood down, hands open, waiting for her to hand him the truth. These stories were not told to scare. They were not cautionary tales. They were offerings to something deeper, acknowledgement that guilt never truly disappears. It just waits to be seen. And the executioner had become its vessel. In old songs sung by widows and blacksmiths, his name was never spoken, but his rhythm pulsed in the verses. A hammer falling, a door closing, a breath held too long. He was there in the pauses, in the lines that didn't rhyme, in the parts too painful to finish. Over time, bards and poets began to use him not as a man, but as a metaphor. He walks beside the king, unseen. She bore her shame like the executioner's cloak. The blade sleeps, but the hand remembers. In plays, he appeared less and less, but his absence was louder than any soliloquy. Whenever justice failed, whenever mercy was mocked, the audience would feel him just out of sight, turning away, unwilling to witness a world that no longer believed in consequence. In darker texts banned by churches, burned by nobles, the executioner took on new forms. A raven that perched above judgment halls, a faceless rider on a horse of rust, a man whose voice turned lies to dust. He became an archetype, a haunting, not of death, but of the truth behind death, that it was never clean, never simple, that someone always paid, even if the world forgot to keep score. And through these retellings, something shifted. He was no longer the symbol of brutality. He became the measure of moral weight, a presence that reminded everyone that justice was not something you watched, but something you carried. In the deep forests, where no roads reached and no laws reigned, solitary shrines began to appear. Stones stacked in circles, cloth tied to branches, bones carved with sigils. No one claimed to build them, but they multiplied. Travelers who stopped there reported dreams of a man standing in the clearing, arms outstretched not in threat but in offering. "Take this burden," he would say. "You cannot leave it behind, only pass it on." They woke weeping, changed. In marketplaces and public squares, artists drew his silhouette onto walls. Always the same, a tall figure, slightly bent, with hands just beginning to lower. People didn't know who drew them, but they never erased them. Some touched them for luck. Others avoided them entirely. Children mimicked the pose, not understanding why it made their parents flinch. In certain dialects, new phrases emerged. "He's walking with the black cloak" meant someone was carrying regret. The rope's whisper meant a secret too dangerous to speak aloud. "Seen by the hood" meant someone had looked into the mirror of their own guilt and survived. The figure became part of the language, sewn into the fabric of meaning. And still, the original man, whoever he was, remained unnamed, unclaimed, because now he belonged to everyone, or perhaps to no one. In remote abbeys, monks debated whether the executioner should be canonized, not as a saint of punishment, but as a guardian of balance. The idea was rejected by Rome, of course. But the monks kept a candle lit anyway. One candle, one shadow, and beneath it the words, "For the one who bore what we would not." The longer history marched on, the more he faded, but he faded like a watermark, not like a stain. Always present, always beneath. In the design of courtrooms, where the judge sat higher than the rest, his echo lived in the quiet drop of the gavel. In the construction of prisons, where certain cells faced no light, his memory hummed in the silence. And in the laws that grew softer, fairer, more careful, he lingered in the caution, in the hesitation, in the fear of becoming what he once was. But myths have a strange way of returning to flesh. And in times of crisis, when order crumbles and justice becomes spectacle again, the executioner rises, not to serve, but to watch, to bear witness, to hold up a mirror to what we pretend not to see. He no longer needs a sword. The stories are sharp enough. He no longer needs a hood. Our own faces are masks enough. He no longer walks among us, because he never left. And in every decision that weighs heavy, in every moment when vengeance whispers sweetly, in every choice to listen instead of strike, he breathes again. Not to judge, not to intervene, but to remember. For us, for the world, for the part of us that still believes some burdens should be carried even if no one thanks you for it, even if no one knows your name, even if all that remains is a story told in the hush between verses. The executee owner is legend now. But legend too can bleed. Legend too can cry. Legend too can kneel in the dark and whisper, "I was here." They stopped drawing him with rope or steel. They stopped placing him in black. The image of the executioner grew softer, stranger, more symbolic with each telling. In one village, he was painted with wings, not because he flew, but because no one ever saw him arrive. In another, his hands were made of fire, not burning, not cruel, but warm, flickering, ungraspable. In stories told by candlelight, children didn't ask if he was real. They asked if he was still listening, still watching, still waiting for the moment someone needed him again, not to kill, not to punish, but to remind them what justice really costs, what silence really means. And what happens when we pretend our hands are clean? Language shifted to carry him. Entire phrases emerged across continents, some spoken in markets, some muttered in beds after bad dreams. "Don't leave your guilt in the dark, or he will pick it up." The black figure walks with the sun behind him. Ask him for forgiveness, not mercy. These were not prayers, they were acknowledgments, like seeing smoke and knowing there had once been fire. In ancient halls turned into museums, forgotten tapestries were unrolled and restored, revealing hidden threads figures with indistinct faces, long arms, and something heavy in their posture. Art historians couldn't explain them. The record said nothing, but viewers felt something. A pressure in the chest, a quiet, a recognition. "He's here," one child said in a gallery, pointing to the corner of the woven scene. "He's always there when they lie." The guide asked, "Who lies?" The child just whispered, "All of them." In spiritual circles and esoteric books banned by temples and kings alike, he began to appear not as a figure of fear, but as a sacred archetype. The bearer, the balancer, the one who walks behind every ruler, behind every judge, behind every parent who says, "This will hurt me more than it hurts you." He became the silent symbol of the unseen cost, the tax not of blood, but of moral erosion. They said he appeared in dreams when someone reached the edge of guilt, of revenge, of despair, and showed them a single path. Not redemption, not release, just honesty, brutal, aching honesty. And that was enough. For some, in rituals now long forgotten except in fragments, young adults coming of age were told to sit in a room alone with a single object, a mask, a rope, a blade, or a mirror, and speak aloud everything they had done, every thought they had buried, every secret they had never dared to name. And then, when they were finished, they would say, "I have spoken, let him carry it," and the object would be buried or burned or passed to the next. Not to erase what had been said, but to acknowledge it, to make it real. In this way, the executioner became less executioner and more vessel, less man and more memory. Less myth and more muscle of the world tensing when the lie is told, releasing when truth is chosen. His presence infused architecture, arches that bowed slightly lower than the rest, floors that creaked at odd angles, doors that opened inward when they should not. People didn't know why they designed things this way. They only said it felt better, more right, more known. In secret societies that never named themselves, black stones were passed between hands. Not valuable, not rare, just smooth, warm from skin. The stone was carried for 7 days, then placed beneath a tree or a stairwell or beneath the floorboards of someone else's home. No note, no explanation. The one who received it knew. Someone else has remembered what must not be forgotten. Someone else has borne the weight. Now it is yours. But not forever. In some villages, during the longest night of the year, people left an empty chair beside the fire. Not for the dead, not for the gods. For him. For the one who sees. For the one who never asks to be thanked, only not to be denied. No food was placed, no drink, only silence. And in that silence, people spoke truths they had never dared say aloud. Children asked parents why their voices shook. Parents told children what they had lost, who they had been, what they regretted. And the next morning, the chair was cold. Always cold, but always empty. In lullabies, he was the shadow that chased nightmares away, not by light, but by listening, by staying, by saying in that endless quiet, "I know. I remember. You are not alone." His name, if he had ever had one, was long since buried, but his title shifted across cultures. The witness. The third hand, the dark listener, the waitkeeper. He no longer executed, he received, held, contained, carried what others could not, and through that became sacred, not holy, sacred, not to be worshipped, but never to be ignored. He became part of moral compass. In old stories, when characters faced impossible choices, when they had to choose between love and truth, between justice and safety, they would hear a voice not from above, but from within. A voice that said, "Choose what you can carry." And in that moment, the executioner was there. Not to advise, not to command, but to remind that every choice writes a sentence. And someone, somewhere, must carry the punctuation. Even in modern courts, long divorced from gallows and iron chains, judges pause before speaking. The oldest ones admit to seeing, in the corner of their vision, a figure. still, watching, not judging, just remembering. They never tell anyone, but their sentences carry a weight no law can define. In the quiet of confessionals, where penance is whispered, the executioner lives in the pause between "I did" and "I'm sorry." He is the breath held, the pulse skipped, the moment before forgiveness is possible, or not. And in that space, people meet themselves, often for the first time. He does not speak. He never has. But somehow you hear him. Every time you say, "I didn't mean to." Every time you say, "I had no choice." Every time you wonder if it mattered. He is there, listening, holding it all, quietly. There comes a point in every myth's life where it no longer belongs to storytellers. It becomes part of the world itself, absorbed into the rhythm of decision and doubt. The executioner, once a man, then a shadow, then a symbol, reached this point quietly, without ceremony, without anyone noticing. But the signs were there, in the hesitation before someone raises their voice in anger, in the silence after someone lies and no one corrects them, in the quiet trembling of a hand that signs a paper they know is wrong. He had become not just a memory, but a threshold, a thing you crossed every time you acted with weight, every time you knew what you were doing and did it anyway, every time you wondered if you were still good. The executioner lived there, not as punishment, but as presence, a stillness that asked nothing, demanded nothing, but refused to leave. In psychological texts and quiet therapy rooms, some began to describe a figure that came to patients in dreams, always silent, always waiting. The therapists never named it, but they recognized it. And the patients, unprompted, often said the same thing. "I don't think he wants to hurt me. I think he wants me to see something. Not what was done, but what it cost." In art, his image shifted again. Less human, less shadowed, more suggested. A fold in the canvas, a black line down the middle, a handprint upside down in the corner of a painting with no other signs of life. The executioner was now a texture, a presence you didn't see until the third glance. And once you saw it, you couldn't unsee it. Music carried him next, not in lyrics, but in pauses, in the single off note in an otherwise perfect score, in the shift from major to minor that no one expected but everyone felt. Composers described a weight pressing on their hands when they reached certain chords. "It wasn't mine," one said. "It belonged to the song. I was just following." The executioner no longer stood on a scaffold. He stood in the silence between words, in the breath someone took before saying "I love you" when they didn't mean it, in the moments before betrayal, in the moments after. He had become the measure of sincerity, of integrity, of unbearable self-awareness. In this way, he passed into the bloodstream of culture, not as a role, not even as a warning, but as an organ, a function, something that kicked in when morality failed, or bent, or became too heavy to lift without consequence. And so people began to feel him without knowing, without the stories, without the myths, just a sudden cold, a flash of doubt, a quiet voice, never words, reminding them that no one gets away with it. Not really. That justice isn't always about punishment. Sometimes it's about balance. And sometimes the balance is internal, invisible, lifelong. In relationships, his shadow lived in the space between two people who had hurt each other but pretended otherwise. The executioner did not condemn. He simply waited until truth returned. In leadership, he stood behind those who made decisions for others and felt no weight. In that void, he grew sharper, not out of vengeance, but because someone had to hold the cost. In education, his whisper was felt by children learning that the world is not fair and deciding whether to become part of the cruelty or part of the burden. In all these things, he was not the end. He was the mirror, the line, the gate. Some said they felt him most before sleep, when the lights were off and the distractions gone, and the mind wandered back to the moments that mattered, where the truth was known and the wrong was chosen anyway. That's where he stood, quiet, watching, not to haunt, not to punish, just to remember with you, so you wouldn't have to carry it alone. In rare spiritual teachings, never written, only passed from elder to initiate, the executioner was described not as a force outside the self, but as a part of the soul reserved for reckoning. A room with no windows, no exits, no lies. And the door to that room only opens when the self is ready, when denial cracks, when certainty dissolves. And in that room, the executioner waits, not with a weapon, but with a mirror. In the deepest versions of the myth, told only once per lifetime to those who had lost everything, and yet still asked for truth, it is said that the executioner weeps, that he never wanted the role, that he was chosen, not born, and that every soul he touches leaves something behind in him, not a name, not a face, just a weight, and he carries it, forever, without thanks, without rest, because someone must, because no one else will. This is why his story persists, not because we fear him, but because we need him, because somewhere inside we all know that justice is never clean, that truth is not easy, and that the cost of doing what must be done should never be nothing. So the executioner remains, as myth, as silence, as rhythm, as breath, as the last thought before sleep when you ask yourself, did I do the right thing? And know the answer, and sit with it, and do not run. That is where he lives now, not on scaffolds, not in history books, but in that stillness, in that bravery, in that unbearable honesty that defines what it means to be human. The executioner is gone, but he is not gone. He is forgotten, but he is not gone. He is legend, but legend too is real. He is you, he is me, he is the weight that reminds us we are not gods, just people, trying, failing, choosing, and carrying it. He doesn't wear a hood anymore. He doesn't carry a blade. He doesn't walk the cobbled streets of silent towns before dawn. But he's still here. He's in the conference room when someone signs a document they don't believe in. He's in the courtroom when silence falls after a lie dressed as truth. He's in the bedroom doorway when someone says, "I'm fine," but their hands are shaking. The executioner never left. He just changed shape. He became atmosphere. In modern cities where neon blurs the night and noise never ends, he watches in quiet places. Parking garages after midnight, office elevators at closing hour, empty apartment kitchens with one dish in the sink and a voicemail unheard. You don't see him, but you know something's there. In your reflection, in the turn of your shoulder when you thought you were alone, in the breath you hold when you almost said it. He has no face anymore, because now, sometimes, he wears yours. That's how deep he's gone. That's how long he's waited. You might feel it when you pass someone on the street and lock eyes for a second too long, when their expression flickers with something unspoken. That is him. That is the part of them that carries weight. That is the part of you that recognizes it. Technology doesn't silence him. Algorithms can't erase him. In fact, sometimes they amplify his presence. When you scroll past the truth and pretend you didn't see it, when you like something you don't believe in, when you leave a comment you wouldn't say out loud, he's there, not angry, just watching. In social movements, he waits at the edges, not in the slogans, not in the noise, but in the pause, when someone asks, "Am I doing this for them or for me?" In families, he sits in the chair across the room when old secrets hover in the air but are never named. In hospitals, he walks the halls where choices are made between more time and more pain. He never tells you what to choose. He only reminds you that the choice matters, that someone will carry it, that someone already does. People think morality is abstract now, a matter of policy or branding or performance. But morality has weight, and the executioner knows weight. He feels it in every small compromise, in every unspoken regret, in every "it's not my responsibility" that echoes louder than any confession. You'll know he's near when you feel tired, but not physically. When your bones feel heavy, and your mind turns inward, RD, searching for the moment you stopped being honest. That's his signal. That's your reckoning. In films and books, he hides in subtext. The character with no backstory, the glance that lingers one frame too long. the unexplained scar. Audiences feel it. Critics call it depth. But it's him. It's the weight that makes a story feel real. In classrooms, students sense him when a lesson becomes more than information, when it becomes a mirror. A teacher asks, "What would you have done?" And the room goes silent. He's in that silence. In therapy, he waits beneath years of deflection, denial, and distraction. When the patient finally says, "I was wrong," he exhales. He's patient. He always has been. He doesn't punish. He never did. That was our misunderstanding. That was our projection. The real executioner simply bears witness. He carries what others can't. And when you face him, truly, he doesn't lift a sword. He opens his hand. And you realize you've been holding the blade all along. In journalism, he appears between the lines, in the editorial choices that leave things unsaid. In politics, he haunts the corridors of decisions made behind closed doors, not to stop them, but to record them somewhere, in ways we don't yet understand. The future remembers. The air holds memory. The ground does not forget. The executioner ensures this. Even in art, his presence remains. Installations that make people uncomfortable for reasons they can't explain. Sculptures that lean slightly off-center. Paintings with missing faces, not mistakes, invitations. To see what was hidden. To feel what was denied. He does not demand guilt. Guilt is easy, cheap. He asks for responsibility, for awareness, for carrying your own weight, even when no one sees it. Especially then. Some people meet him early. Children who grow up too fast. Survivors. Whistleblowers. People who say, "I couldn't stay silent." They carry the weight before they know its name. And they recognize him when he comes. Not with fear. With familiarity. With a nod. With a quiet, "I see you too." Others don't meet him until later. A moment of loss. A betrayal. A mistake that can't be undone. And suddenly, he's there. Not to punish, to accompany, to witness, to walk beside. He is not justice. He is not vengeance. He is the cost. And he walks with those who choose to pay it. He's been called many things. Conscience, karma, memory. But none of these are quite right. Because he is older than all of them. He is the weight behind the word should. The shadow in if only. The echo in "I knew better." He is the moment before the apology, the breath after the decision, the part of you that never forgets. And in this modern world, drowning in noise and noise about noise, he remains quiet, still, present, waiting for you to notice him, not to confess, not to beg, but to sit, to breathe, to say, "Yes, I did that. I was there. I chose." That's all. That's enough. That's everything. The executioner doesn't need more. He never did. He just needed us to remember. That weight is not the enemy. It's the proof that you're alive, that you care, that you still feel what should be felt. Even now, even here, even when no one else does. Especially then. The modern world thinks it has no use for executioners. It believes that with enough policies, enough systems, enough screens between us and the consequences, we have outgrown the need for someone to hold the blade. But that's a delusion, a comfortable one, an illusion built on silence and distance. The executioner never needed the blade. He never needed the scaffold. He only needed the truth. And truth, no matter how dressed, still bleeds, still demands to be seen. Still needs someone to hold the moment steady when everyone else looks away. Today, the executioner shows up in places with no blood, no cries, just decisions, quiet, signed, irreversible. He's there when a person signs away their land to a corporation, when a board votes to cut funding for a shelter, when someone checks a box without knowing what it means for someone else. These are modern executions, not of life perhaps, but of dignity, of possibility, of trust. And someone still stands by. Someone still feels the weight. That is the new executioner. He doesn't act alone. He doesn't act at all. He listens. He observes. He carries. In offices, it's the employee who knows the numbers don't match, but says nothing. In hospitals, it's the administrator who cuts staff to balance a budget. In factories, it's the worker who pulls the lever, knowing where the waste goes. No evil, just process. But the weight remains, and someone must bear it. That's him. That's you. That's anyone who pauses long enough to feel. Our systems aren't neutral. They are soaked with invisible hands, ghostly decisions, and the executioner walks through them like fog, feeling every ripple, every unseen casualty, every person uncounted. In media, he flickers between frames. A scene cut too short. A silence where the moment the truth was known, but the headline chose something else. In education, he lingers in the syllabi, in the years of missing context, in the stories never shared because they made people uncomfortable. He is that discomfort. He is the pause that makes us look again. In friendships, he exists in the unspoken moments, when someone needed you and you didn't ask. When someone said, "I'm fine," and you accepted it, because it was simpler. In families, he lives in inheritance, not of wealth, but of silence. Of expectations passed down without words, of wounds covered by time, not care. In systems, he waits in rooms where decisions are made without witness. He keeps records no one writes, not on paper, in breath, in memory, in the way words shift. Words that once meant truth now serve benefit. Words that once meant harm now mean entertainment. And he listens. He remembers. He endures. The reminder doesn't act anymore. He waits for us to notice that we already do. In messages never sent. In apologies not spoken. In help not offered. These are pauses. These are absences with shape. And the reminder understands their weight. Not to punish, but to hold. Because someone must. In conversations, people say, "I did nothing wrong, but I feel unsettled." And the listener knows what it means. It means the reminder is present. It means something was lost, not by fault, but by nearness. The reminder walks with those who were close to hurt and couldn't stop it, even when they weren't to blame. He doesn't accuse, he sees. The feeling of, "I should have," he stays there. In moments of truth, his presence sharpens. When something real is said too boldly and the reply is absence or resistance, he doesn't cheer the shout. He doesn't condemn the silence. He listens to what's left unsaid, to what's whispered into wind. He waits for someone to see the cost of pretending all is well, of pretending the past is quiet. In the stillness, he hears it, the voices beneath the story, the hands behind the result, the lives beneath the achievement. He doesn't demand, he just remains until someone else notices, until someone else says, "That matters." In daily rituals, he reappears, not in garments or ceremonies, but in small habits that carry more than meaning. A name said at a resting place, a meal set on a doorstep, a song played once a year for someone never discussed. These are acts of memory, of responsibility, and the reminder stands near them, acknowledges, honors, moves on. In our thoughts, he waits in moments of quiet. When the phone is off, the screen is dark, the world is sleeping, and suddenly you remember. The moment, the one you tucked away, the choice, the one you dressed as logic, and you breathe, and you feel it, and you wish it would leave. But it doesn't, because he's there, not to frighten, to remind that being human isn't about getting it right. It's about holding what we've done, not hiding, not performing, holding, naming, continuing. In that, the reminder finds calm, not forgiveness, that's not his to give, but stillness, because someone looked, someone saw, someone said, "That was me," or "I let that pass," or "I'm still here because someone else helped me." That's enough. That's everything. That's the shift, not from guilt to innocence, but from silence to awareness, from forgetting to remembering, from absence to presence. He is not a relic. He is a rhythm. He is not judgment. He is reflection. He is not curse. He is condition of truth, of memory, of being awake in a world that demands much, but explains little. And we carry him not because we wanted to, but because care leaves traces, because remembering requires weight, and being kind means feeling it, not just from our own lives, but from those that touched ours, crossed paths, made things different, and continued differently. The reminder doesn't ask for justice. He asks for memory. He needs us to say, "This matters," even when no one's looking, especially then. They say history forgets, but it doesn't. It just waits. Beneath monuments, beneath silence, beneath the small choices people don't think matter. It waits. And when it returns, it doesn't shout. It doesn't break the doors. It whispers, just enough to make you turn your head, just enough to slow your breath, just enough to make you feel the weight. That's him. That's always been him. The executioner doesn't crave recognition. He doesn't need revenge. He only asks that the story be complete, that the shadow be seen, not feared, that the silence be named, not filled, that someone, somewhere, says, "Yes, that happened, and it mattered." In the end, he becomes less a person and more a question. Not who died, but who stood still. Not what was done, but what was allowed. Not where is the blame, but where is the weight now? You carry it. I carry it. Not as punishment, as memory, as proof that we were here, that we knew, that we felt something and didn't run. He lives now in the space between thoughts, in the choice not to speak, in the moment after the laugh when something flickers behind the eyes, in the long pause when someone says, "I didn't mean to," and we both know they did. And still we listen, not to condemn, but to understand. And there, in that breath, he finds his place. In dreams, he appears not as monster, but as a room, a corridor, a staircase with no top. You walk, and the walls don't end. Because there's more, always more, every act, every silence, every look away. It lives there, not to torment, to be felt. The dream doesn't end. It fades, slowly. As you wake up with your jaw clenched and something heavy behind your ribs, you don't remember why, but he does. In cities, he walks past you on the train. He sits 2 rows back in the cafe. He brushes your shoulder on the sidewalk. You won't recognize him, but for a moment, you'll feel a pull. Like the air has shape, like something unsaid passed through. That's him, moving on, waiting for someone else to notice. In your own life, he arrives less with grand events and more with small hesitations. The time you didn't call, the message you never sent, the truth you reshaped just slightly to stay comfortable. He sees all of it, not with judgment, with presence. Because someone should. Not everything that breaks leaves a sound. Not everything that ends is mourned. And not everyone who causes harm ever knows. But he knows. And he remembers. And he waits for us to do the same. In art, he becomes metaphor. In therapy, he becomes pattern. In politics, he becomes history. In silence, he becomes unbearable. Until we speak. Until we breathe. Until we allow ourselves to feel the ache we buried long ago. That ache is not weakness. It's evidence of conscience, of care, of being human. Still, we may not wear black hoods anymore. We may not sharpen blades. But we still choose who to look at, who to protect, who to forget. And those choices have weight. They always have. The executioner is simply the one who never pretends otherwise. In children, he watches gently, hoping they don't learn the weight too soon. In elders, he lingers softly, honoring what they carried in silence. And in all of us, he waits, not for guilt, but for truth, the final truth. That we are all capable of harm, of silence, of grace, of presence, of witnessing. And in that balance, the executioner finds peace. Not because justice was done, but because someone saw, someone stayed. Someone said, "I remember." That's all he ever needed. Not statues, not names, just remembrance. So he could finally stop walking, finally stop carrying, finally rest. And maybe, just maybe, so could we.